Hi, I'm Mike Donohoe, and I'm delighted to be joined today by the founder and MD of Caspian Insurance, Oliver Rayner. We're going to be talking today about the journey from idea to exit. Every business begins with a vision, but turning that vision into a successful business requires navigation of challenges, risks, and opportunities at every stage. So, Ollie, in the early days, founders wear so many hats. Can you go back to the time when the idea first came to you about starting your own business and the challenges that presented at that time?
Yeah, so we first started off in 2016. We had the concept that we wanted to do something in protection in the insurance space. We spent a few months before even starting the business of doing a bit of a project plan and working out how we were going to do it, as every business does in a business plan. One of the hardest initial challenges that we faced was recruiting a team of staff, because we worked out we needed 6 people to join us before you've got any business. So interviewing people that were relatively junior members of staff in a hotel lobby and pitching them a concept of a business that didn't exist yet was quite an interesting challenge. And from that, then on the day you start, and only 3 of them turn up rather than 6, presented its own initial challenges. But moving forward from that, I really found that when we started the business and we were going in the early stages, you kind of pivot quite a lot. So what you thought was going to be the business plan and rolling that business plan out turned out to be something quite different from what actually happened in reality. And we had multiple stages whereby it was, okay, build a little bit of a team, scale back, it didn't work, start again. And there's multiple pivots of that business in the sort of the first 12 to 24 months. And that's one of the biggest challenges that we found, of as well as doing every job under the sun, was constantly evaluating, were you doing the right thing? Should you stick it out longer, or should you wind back and pivot the business?
And in those early stages, that business then is heavily reliant on, in this case, yourself as the founder. How did that look for you in the early stages? Like, how did you have to influence and control that early stage?
Yeah, so when you start out, I found you doing pretty much every role that was there. And that's doing for everything from trying to be a sales coach, a sales leader, through to doing compliance, dealing with partners, dealing with payroll. It evolved everything. You become a bit of a jack of all trades to it, and working every hour under the sun. Because you're in a stage where you've not really got the revenues coming in yet to support outsourcing some of those roles, taking them on yourself and just trying to make it work best you can without incurring more cost. And you develop a bit of mindset of, well, I might as well do it myself because we can't really afford to outsource it. Which just means you work a ridiculous amount of hours for little gain in the early stages.
And obviously you've started as well in a regulated environment as well. So, you're not just responsible for the business, but the regulation side of it. It's a financial services, highly regulated area. So you have all these additional things that you have to take care of as well at the time, not just what's going on inside, the 4 walls.
Yeah, absolutely. You're then responsible for the conduct of everybody within the business.
Yeah.
It's quite a new concept. And I'd had businesses before, so I fortunately knew a little bit about how businesses operate, but not in so much of a regulated environment. So it was a big learning curve, and making sure you take the responsibility, doing things the right way by the customer, but also trying to make the business profitable enough to continue running as a going concern and paying the staff. It's a real challenge.
Exactly. And timing of growth as well is hugely important. So, we, as a business, we give advice to lots of different businesses, and knowing where your opportunity to grow and when, and getting that right, is often where people either really succeed or don't in those first years. And guess until you've actually been in that position and faced those challenges, you don't really know how difficult a balancing point that is, to know when to try and grow, or like you said, when you might have to learn and scale back before you can go again.
Yeah, and you want to be ambitious and you want to grow and you want to, everybody starts a business. A lot of them will have these plans of growth, and it's working out then. Yes, the plan may or may not be right. You may need to rescale, but also the team that you bring in may or may not be right. They might be right that moment in time. As you grow the business, suddenly you find some of the early members of staff aren't aligned with the growth and the journey of the business and how the business evolves. So you end up having to re-recruit to stay where you were, as well as trying to grow. And that's a challenge that I don't think I really appreciated when I started the business of what that would do. And also when people come on, sometimes they weren't quite what you thought they were in
Yeah.
the early stages. We've all probably come across people who did a good interview at the time, and then when it turned out they weren't quite as they were. So these are all sort of factors that really took quite a lot of time and a lot of thought when we were in those early stages of the business.
And obviously, I've known you for a long time now. And one of the things that you are really, really key on is the way that people interact with your customers. So the service and the advice that you give and the way in which we do it. And that's never changed. You've kept that from your idea all the way to where we are today as a business. But was that particularly more difficult or more challenging to manage in the early days when you don't have a management structure and you don't have people that can do that for you? You're trying to do it all?
Yeah, I'd say very much so. If you think about it, our core fundamental ethos of the business to really treat every customer like a family member.
Yeah.
And if it was your mother or your auntie or your father, uncle on the phone, would you be doing advice in a certain way, and how would you treat them? And how making sure that ethos. And now a lot of people buy into that in terms of the staff and will follow that. But then trying to manage and monitor that across a number of members of staff who may have some picked up good habits, some picked up bad habits along the way from their experience prior to joining you. It's physically impossible to have, for example, 10 members of staff and be listening to every call that they make all of the time. So it's just then that we had to really think about how do we then build a framework in place to ensure that quality still maintains. But I would regularly at those points in time download calls that people made and they dip test them and listen to them in the car on the way home or on the way into work, because that's the only time I physically had where I could actually spend an hour or 2 hours a day listening to calls and checking quality. So it became extremely difficult.
Yeah. And I think, we work with a lot of other businesses, and, the ones that we see that are the most successful, the ones that have the same sort of ethos and the same sort of principle that everybody buys into what the business is trying to do. Do you see that as something that's becoming even more important in business nowadays?
Yeah, I think customers now are really looking for companies that they can relate with, checking that the company aligns with their own personal values and getting that across. And it really comes down to what the ethos of the business was when it was set up. And for us, it's always been helping as many customers as we can, doing things the right way with a real professional flair, but also really approachable and trying to lean on the fact that, we are a northern business. Northerners are famous for being quite friendly as businesses. So we try and lean on that, make sure that's embedded into the company. And we find that the customers that we speak to hopefully relate to that, and that comes across on the phone still now or on the face-to-face meetings. That's been the same from day one. And I think in the market now, when consumers have so much choice and so much self-serve and what they want to do themselves, them being able to do their own research, but when they do actually engage with a company, realising their values perhaps match what they would like for themselves.
Their expectations,
their expectations, and in terms of making them feel comfortable and feel like that whoever's working with them is relatable to them, I think is really important. It's never been more important than it is now, especially with all the differences in technology stuff in the current market.
So we're through the first, early stages of the business, the first couple of years. And how did the challenges change for you as a founder as you start to get towards wanting growth for the business?
Well, where do I start? There's a lot of different challenges that you face. So it comes at you in every different area of the business. As you start wanting growth, you've obviously got to do your growth plans and your financial planning. But then it comes down to even sort of logistical things of like, what do you do with space and office space? When we first started the business, we didn't want to take too much risk and weren't sure how well it's going to work. We started in a very small office personally that we quite quickly outgrew, and we took a 3-month lease on it, moved into the next space. I think business owners don't realise what kind of stress that can put on the business. You get nervous about moving from an environment whereby you can have a co-working space or a small space, something where you've got a big commitment on it. That was one of the pressures that we found, and we had a policy. We moved a few times in the first few years, and our policy was outgrow the space we were in so we can afford the next space. But then that would bring its own challenges, whereby we had probably outgrown some of the spaces by 10-ish%, maybe a bit more. But then you've got people come in for an interview and not realising and thinking everybody sat very close together. We had smaller desks, just were waiting to try and afford to the next space. And I think a big thing for the businesses is not putting too much financial pressure on yourselves as you're trying to grow, and trying to have things that are beyond your means, but then making sure that all your staff are bought into the journey and fully understand why you're going through this transition phase and what the future will look like, and keeping sharing that message with the staff whilst you go through those transitions.
And were you looking at this stage then at where are your biggest pressures from a turnover perspective, but also trying to, like you mentioned there, trying to make sure that your costs, your operating costs, aren't going at a faster rate than your turnover's going up? Because that's obviously, as you start to make profit as a business, those two things are your key metrics.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really hard balancing act, and there's no secret recipe for it, because every business is quite different in depending on how your business operates. For us, it was just making sure that the growth was linear and not trying to grow too quick beyond your means, because so many businesses will grow, think they've cracked it because they've had a couple of big months, gone a huge recruitment drive and try and scale, but perhaps they've been a bit too optimistic, and then suddenly they put too much pressure on the business. Either the quality of the people they've got in may dip, or even financially put pressure on it, and sometimes you lose the good people that you did have because you put too much pressure on other areas of the business. Having said that, is getting the balance between not being too pessimistic and not seeing the opportunity to grow, and not really growing at the times, not seizing the opportunities that you see because you're being too reserved. So it's trying to find that balance between it is really difficult, and something that no one can really prepare you for. And even if you did do it again, you just kind of got to go with your gut and trying to work out what is right for the business, what's right for the team, trying to get that sweet spot.
Sounds like you'd have had a few sleepless nights back in those days.
Yeah,
trying to balance all that.
Very late nights on that. Yeah, working every hour under the sun, working on holidays, and just a lot of stress that gets carried in those early stages. A lot of people talk about it, but until you've been through it, it can be one of the most rewarding things you've ever done, but one of the most stressful as well.
So I want to talk about people now in the early stages. So how did the recruitment growth, how did you manage that side of things in those sort of early years as you're starting to grow? Is that still your responsibility as the founder and MD? Are you still doing all of that recruitment? Are you still responsible for that side of things?
It's a tricky one, again, because it depends what your personal skill set is. I was fortunate that I'd worked a few years in the recruitment industry, so I was very comfortable with recruitment, and I kind of knew what type of person I wanted and what kind of culture we're trying to build. But regardless of whether you've got the recruitment skills or not, how you go about it, having the founder and the original team, making sure that people that come in through the door are aligned with your vision is so important. If you bring on the wrong member of staff, it can really be a sort of a distraction for the rest of the team, and it can really put some toxicity in your team if you're not careful. So I had a policy that I did all the recruitment for the first probably about 7 years, and probably kept on to it way longer than we should have done, just purely for the reason that I was a bit OCD about who we had coming through the door. But one thing that resulted out of that is that we had a really good culture. Everybody was aligned. I knew, as a founder, I knew everybody that came through the door. So if a founder can continue to be part of that recruitment process for as long as it is feasible, it really helps ensure that you've got the right culture that you started with and what the business is all about for people coming in.
It's really interesting, this, because I think for a lot of people, it won't be their skill set. It won't be something they enjoy. So it might be one of the first things that they pass to, an operation manager or whoever in the business. But actually, it's not just about the people, it's your culture and the behaviours and everything else that it protects, which will all have a knock-on effect from the business performance directly if you don't get it right in those early stages.
There's two key lessons that I probably teach myself from the journey that we've had. First of all is that when somebody comes in, you've got to get that warm feeling about them. So when they come in, I'm learning about what they like to do. Do they have a great culture fit? What they like outside of work? And do you get that warm feeling? For me, it was never quite right unless you came out of the interview going, I need to do everything to get this person. They are just so right. I got excited and got the buzz. Yeah. If I ever come out of it 50-50 and I'm thinking I'm going to take the weekend to think about it, that's a no. Every time I've gone against my gut and even had to think about it, it's never really worked out for us. So that's always the policy, and we teach that to the staff now, is making sure that you get that warm, fuzzy feeling with the member of staff. And the second one is sort of similar to that, but it's making sure that you take the philosophy of, am I hiring them for the skill that they've got? If they didn't have that skill, are they the right person?
Yeah.
Because if you just hire based on the skill somebody's got, but they're not the right culture fit, that's only a temporary fix. So if they had no skill, if they had no skills, no experience in what they're doing, would you be prepared to train them up? If that's a yes and they have got the skills, they're going to be a superstar for you.
And that's a massive insight into just how important trusting your gut is when it comes to bringing people in that you want to continue that culture and those behaviors that you set, before this business even started.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also have to realise that although your gut will carry you for most of the way, sometimes you have got it wrong, or somebody might not present themselves right through the interview process, and they might have come across like somebody that they weren't. And when they're in the business, then if they then aren't the right culture fit and it's causing an issue, it's just knowing when to reapproach that and making sure that you keep honing the team and making sure the culture's right. And there's some really difficult decisions along the way there, making sure that you make sure that the team are right for each other, the right people are in the business, and it's got the right environment that you're looking for. And it's constantly just evaluating that, making sure that everybody gets on and there's no issue there.
We work in a highly competitive part of financial services. How did that affect your growth plans?
Yeah, so we had a scale-up plan, and in terms of how we rolled that out, it was really around the staff and the people, about who we could bring on board. And we quite quickly realised it's not just about attracting the right staff and attracting the right people with the right culture and people have the same ethos that you want. It's about retaining them as well. We really tried to understand what motivates our employees to come to work, and a lot of that can be around their families as well. So it wasn't just about them and what motivates them. It's about making sure that they look after who's most important to them. And that would either be the partner, or if they've got children, it's the partner too. So we introduced quite a lot of schemes within the business and a lot of benefits that can really help them, giving them things like the birthday off so they can spend time with the family, but also bringing in policies that could really help benefit them and the family. So things like we put in healthcare for some of the certain employees, that not just for them, but also for their family too. And when people's partners or children have claimed on policies and actually used some of the benefits, the employee that works for you gets really appreciative of what you've actually done for them and how you've gone above and beyond as an employer. And that really goes down to other things as well, like having their doctor's appointments. Being able to do doctor's appointments over video calls was helpful for them. They really saw that as a benefit. We also surveyed the staff to work out what is going to be useful for them, what's going to really benefit them, and understanding to make sure that our proposition and what we do as an employer really aligned with what's going on in their personal circumstances and what it is they want from an employer.
So during these early growth stages then, what was the biggest risk that you identified that would cause you to stall at that point?
People. Absolutely no doubt it's the people. Having the right team in place was so important to us. They were everything to the business, particularly in a services-led business that's client-facing. But the leaders of those people within the business are so totally crucial to the growth. So replacing those would have been really, really difficult for us as a business. What I did personally was try to get to know everybody who's in those kind of roles, taking the extra steps to understand what motivates them, understanding their family dynamic, why they come to work, why do they come to work for us, and making sure that whatever we do is geared around them so they feel a part of the journey, sharing those journey plans with them, sharing the growth plans with them, but also understanding what was keeping them there rather than looking at competitors who had been going longer or could even pay more salary. What was the reasons why they came here, and what's the reasons why they were invested in working for the company longer term?
And it sounds like then the impact that would have had on you were aware of. So as the founder, if you'd have taken, we talked at the beginning about having to wear so many hats, but as you start to, diversify in terms of your employees and you've got people in specialist areas, was one of your concerns the effect that not having them there would have on your ability to maintain that growth in terms of your turnover?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can quickly see that when they go on holiday and you'd realise how much work they did and what hole they would leave if they weren't there. By covering that when you're a small business, you quickly think, oh my God, if they weren't here all the time, this is exactly the sort of thing I'd be having to do on a daily basis, plus trying to spend the time and effort and cost of trying to recruit somebody to replace them. It gave you a bit of a taste of what life would be like if they left.
That's really interesting that the lesson comes from having a short-term absence in terms of holidays and things like that, makes you realise what would happen if they weren't here for 6 months, 12 months, or they just left completely.
Yeah, and you try your best not to bother them, our principal while they're on holiday, but you'd be so itching to pick up the phone and just ask the question or get a bit of advice from them if it's something that wasn't your area.
Yeah.
Quite quickly makes you realise and see how important it is. And it really makes you reflect on that and go, right, how can I make sure that they are solidified within the business and they do stay and they do continue to work here? And how can we continue moving forward with keeping them as a part of the journey?
So presumably now at this stage, you are starting to recruit some quite senior positions. Are you having to change the way in which you recruit to match that? And what I mean by that is, are you looking at ways in which you can add value to people beyond the paycheck in order to get a higher caliber of person in the door?
Yeah, as you grow as a business, you then start recruiting for people that have a different skill than you do. But then you quite quickly realise, how am I going to then retain them and keep them within the business and get them bought into that journey? So you start looking at different ways you can incentivise them, whether it be financial or with time or with benefits on top of that, and understanding what is most important to them and just aligning that to what they want. And you go from there.
How has your role as founder evolved over the years?
Good question. It's evolved massively over the time. And that, if you look at each year the business has been trading, it's probably evolved more and more. It's got a bit more regular in the last couple of years. But when you start the business, you end up doing every role because you don't want to pay somebody to do some other parts of the role, and you can control freak. Especially if you worked in an employed environment, you take accountability previously for everything of you doing a certain sector. But nobody ever really teaches you to delegate. No one ever really teaches you to go, actually, is my time better spent doing something else? Could I have somebody else do that part of it so I can spend more time on the bits people can't work on? So you go from working every role in the business to having this transition as you get a bit larger, to having certain parts of your role delegated out, and really having that maturity to stop working in the business every day and you're working in it, to really taking a step back and working on it. Before you start the business, you actually work on it. Because when you start and do business plans, it's all about on and how you're going to get your growth. And as soon as you start up, you're getting stuck in there and you're in that business. And that can be stuck in the trenches for a number of years, bit by bit, having the maturity to realise, how can I start to replace certain parts of what I do? Am I going to pay somebody to do another job that I feel I could do better than anyone else because I'm the business owner? I know it better than everybody, and I'm OCD. And having the maturity to let somebody else do it and run with it whilst you work on other things is really tough. And as you evolve and you get a bit larger and you get a real team and structure underneath you that can really be specialists in all their fields, my role now is really working on the business, and I don't really work in very much on the day-to-day. And that can take a real shift. It's really hard to take that step away. And sometimes it's even, I kick myself out of certain reports, so I wouldn't keep checking them all the time. I wouldn't have OCD and checking what everybody's doing every few minutes. That took years to try and evolve into that. But way better for it, because it gave me a lot of better work-life balance at the back end of it. I've got a team now who I trust, but getting there was quite the journey.
Yeah, and it's quite easy. We speak to a lot of business owners. It's quite easy to see the passion that people have for their own businesses. And the challenge that comes with that is, can you let go? Can you delegate? Is that something that you've tried to instill in others as well?
Yeah, very much so. It's quite a hard mindset to shift yourself, but once you've done that, as you grow as a business and you've got a leadership team below you, or you might have multiple different layers, then trying to re-educate the teams below you, they've got to do the same with their team and trust on their team to be able to do certain roles. Especially people being promoted from within and they are new to more of a leadership position, they have the same bad habits that you would have done, which is you don't delegate, you try and do everything yourself. Which is a great skill for a small business entrepreneur, and it's great to have that accountability, but then learning who can do something better than you, or if somebody does something that frees up your time to focus on things that others can't within your team is quite hard to really get the team motivated and bought into that. And it's a bit of a moving target, because throughout the whole life of the business, people will naturally, every time there's a new project to do, I'm still guilty of it now, a new project comes up, I'll try and do it all myself start to finish, because the existing business does kind of run by itself a little bit. And it's just trying to be mature about it and going, you've only got so many waking hours in a week, there's only so much you can do, and how can you scale and grow without doing everything yourself?
And it's also, I guess, then, how does that translate into a wider plan? So, if you look at your immediate team now, you have people that are specialists very much in their area, and your job is to steer them and naturally then that will shape the direction that the business goes in, with you only having to have direct involvement with people as opposed to, as you said, doing everything yourself.
Yeah, and as you evolve, you go from, as I mentioned, you go from having that culture whereby you're working in the business to on it. And as you evolve more and more and you get a leadership team who then also start working a bit more on it rather than directly in it, because perhaps the people below them work in the business and they're working a bit on, your role shifts as a leader and a founder, that you're then working out, what are we doing X amount of time in the future, 6 months, 12 months, 3 years in the future. And you start really evolving to work on like a 5-year plan. You start working really far ahead. And what happens then is your leadership team that are working alongside you will then start focusing on what's happening in the next few months, and you start going further and further into the future. And again, that sort of change goes down through the hierarchy of the business of who's delegating to who about what is happening on a day-to-day basis.
It feels like as a founder, you're almost going full circle here. So you have the concept, you do all the preparation, you have the ideas, the planning, the business plans, all the stuff you talked about. And then that all goes out the window because you've got to do 17 people's different jobs in the first few years. And then as the growth comes, then you start to slowly step away, even if it's a real challenge for you as an individual, like it was for me from what you're saying. But actually, in order to be successful stage by stage, that's the journey a founder would have to go through.
Yeah, I'd say that's a perfect summary of the life cycle. I've never really thought about it like that before, that you end up doing almost a similar role to what you started out with the vision of the business. But for me, it probably took about 7 years before you get back there. From as soon as that goes out the window, once you're in your first month of trading, it's about a 7-year period before you get back to that spirit of entrepreneurialism and that planning and really starting to plan ahead. It probably is the life cycle of a business owner, leader.
It's fascinating that a business that's done very well to navigate, so much up and down, not just in our sector, in our industry, but in the world. Yet, for you as an individual, as the founder, that was a 7-year journey that you went on to go from a concept to finally starting to feel like you could look forward again.
Yeah, you don't really lose the entrepreneurial spirit that you had from the early days. And as we've grown and scaled as a business, I'm sure many businesses do, and you've pivoted and such along the way, as you get to that situation where you've got a number of directors and supporting leaders running the operation and also planning for what's going to happen in the next few months, it gives you a chance to diversify then and setting up new divisions or new spin-off branches of the business. And you get that entrepreneurial startup vibe back within subsectors of the business. So for us, we've expanded out into multiple different areas of different types of insurance, for example, and each one of those becomes like a mini startup within the business, almost runs its own P&L, and you get that startup kick of it again. But again, fortunately, not having to do every single role in the business. When we do those, we've got finance and other bits that we do, but so I get to have the benefit of having the entrepreneurialism and the excitement of starting a new division without having to do every single bit of legwork along the way in the 17-hour days.
Yeah, I was just thinking the very same in terms of, the lessons you learn as a founder, and having been through that journey for a business as a whole, being able to add real diversification in terms of whether it's product lines, customer lines, distribution contracts, whatever it might be, you get to do the start again, good side of it, without having to go on that 7-year journey again.
Yeah, you get to have your cake and eat it. You get the best of both worlds. But as you go through, it's just about doing those business plans and making sure that you're not just diversifying for the sake of it. Yeah. You're not spreading yourself too thin, and making sure that your cash cow, your main business, isn't falling down because you've spent too much time trying to think about what else. And there's no real secret to how you do that. I think it's just doing forward planning and making sure that you're realistic about what is physically possible, having the right team to help you carry that out, and diversifying at the right times with the right people, but not taking too much of your time on the side project whilst it's still at its infancy from what your day job is.
Yeah, and I think that's, you look at the time frames involved as well for a lot of businesses. So, you're, like I say, almost 10 years now since the start of Caspian. Would you have done that sooner in hindsight, or do you think you got the timing right? Do you have any advice for founders in that?
Yeah, I think we took quite a few years before we really started diversifying. But what that doesn't really reflect on is how many times the business actually pivoted from our main core business, pivoted multiple times in that side, which was almost felt a bit like diversifying. It's quite a similar journey when you pivot and start doing something slightly different. And that could be down to how you generate customer inquiries or how you service your customers or what the processes is. It was probably stable for a couple of years after all the pivoting before we started then diversifying, trying to branch out and not distract ourselves from what the day job was.
Yeah. And, the core ethos remains the same. You might be looking into other areas or talking to different types of customers. But essentially, it's the same thing that started all those years ago, that you pride yourself on the advice, the professionalism and the service, and treating everybody as if they're a family member. So carrying that through will help you as you move forward and you look to the future, knowing that, successfully pivoting once might lead to something else, or diversifying once might lead to something else. So my question is, as you look forward now, what do you see your biggest challenges are as a founder?
One of the biggest challenges I see now for every business is there's an ever-evolving landscape. Never more so now than really probably since the introduction of email or even the web, and that's the introduction of AI. I know it's a buzzword, everybody's talking about it, but we're really seeing a big difference and a big shift in the way consumers, the way businesses are interacting on a personal level. People aren't using Google as much, for instance, people are using AI. And how does that really affect your business? How does that affect your staff? Should you be using it? Should you not be using it? Everyone's really got to think now about what kind of strategy they're going to do. Is there going to be a pivot in your business? Is it going to affect the way you trade? You don't want to be the next Kodak who didn't embrace technology. You've got to look at how your customers are interacting. So one of the biggest challenges is do you need to pivot as a business? And if you do, are you sharing that with your staff? Are you explaining to them what's changing in the industry, what you're going to do about it? Are you asking them for feedback of how things could shift, how things could change? And really making sure that they know you're aware of a shifting landscape, making sure your team are bought into the shifting landscape, and then working out the plan of what you do to roll out on it to make sure that you go with the times and making sure that the business is sustainable going forward and everybody's still on board with how that journey pans out.
It's fascinating because those things you're going through, you're addressing them, you're embracing them, and you're looking at your plans. As a founder, what's your thought process when things happen that are outside of your control? So obviously you work in a highly regulated financial services environment. So when something changes and you have to adapt quickly, now you have a business with, a large number of employees, a large number of customers. What's your thought process as to adapting or pivoting when it's outside of your control?
Yeah, so first and foremost, you need to make sure that your customers are still protected. Never more so than if you have a regulated business, because you're bound to do so. But really, you want to make sure that they are serviced in the right way, they're looked after in the right way, and also your staff are as well. So it's just making sure that your customers, as well as your team, are constantly looked after, updated of any changes. But then me trying to think about the forward landscape. What else is changing? What do you see on the horizon? And how can you make sure that your customers and your team are serviced in the best way and looked after in the best way you can, whilst keeping the morals of the business intact, really?
And wherever possible, I guess, trying to stay ahead of these types of things, trying to, understand what's coming around the corner potentially in financial services, and being able to adapt and continue to do exactly what you do well, in the future. Which kind of, I guess, leads me to when we talk about strategy, it's a buzzword, everybody talks about it. For you as an individual, as a founder, if you decide, or the business decides, whether it's you or not, that there is a pivot, there is going to be a change direction, what's your decision-making strategy to decide whether you think that is the right thing to do or not? Do you have a process to go through?
Yeah, I think you've got to look at opportunity cost. You've got to look at what the risk is if you do take action and what the risk is if you don't take action, and try and do a bit of a cost model on that. just forward seeing what could go wrong and just trying to mitigate against it, against every different avenue that could, and make sure you've got a backup plan of what could happen in place, as well as trying to capitalise and really benefit from any opportunity of a shifting landscape, which is a bit of an offensive play and a defensive play at the same time, making sure that I'm covered against the worst case scenarios. But if things go in a certain way, how could you mitigate and go with those? In terms of things we spoke about there, in terms of a shifting landscape, we've been thinking about it for the last 2-3 years of what would happen if, and then we've really noticed it has been a shift in the landscape, and then we're working out how we can move with the times on it. So it's just really just embracing new technology, embracing new ideas, and just thinking about how could you benefit those for the business. And if that's not your bag, if you're not really into tech, I'm fortunate that I've had a tech background. I love new technology and change, but I appreciate some business leaders might not. Try and find someone within your team that could champion that for you, or rely on an external consultancy. And how can you import that skill within your team so that you can embrace change and you can forward plan and make sure that your business does survive and keep with the times?
Yeah, and I guess that gives you an opportunity as a business then that you're not going to get left behind. You know, there's a lot of talk, particularly in financial services at the moment, that those that aren't embracing tech and those that aren't at the drivers at the forefront of it, and you know, not everything will be perfect first time when it comes to tech. That's just the way it is. But as you said, the landscape is changing. How important is it for you to be seen as a leader in that? Is that something that you want as a reputation for your business?
I think the points you mentioned don't just really affect financial services. It's every business has to embrace it. Everyone's noticed some sort of change, whether you're using it or not, with what's come out in terms of technology in the last couple of years. And I think it's, for us, it's not necessarily, I don't really mind too much about the recognition of being a forefront in tech. It's just making sure that we are embracing new concepts and new ideas and making sure that we can better service our clients. How can we make things simpler for people? Really, how can we give a better customer outcome? How can we help our customers more, whilst also keeping our staff engaged? We don't want to be a team of robots. We're not going to embrace AI to the level whereby there will be no team there. But where we see it is we want to make sure that our core team is still fully functioning, fully operating, but we can do a better job to all of our customers by utilising new technology and new services.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the philosophy will be echoed around the business world in terms of, you know, business growth and businesses evolve depending on the time frame in which they were set up. You know, the way that businesses transacted in the 90s to the 2000s is completely different to the way things are today. So, you know, staying relevant and understanding the market that you're operating in and the time frame you're operating in is going to be hugely important. I think, you know, if you look at the Caspian journey for a second, you know, you're long past the days of being a startup business. Is there any particular point in time when you thought, right, it's got serious now. Now I need to plan?
No. I would say throughout the whole journey, I never really look back, and I think a lot of business owners that I spoke to can probably appreciate this. You never really look back and go, aren't we great? Aren't we brilliant? Because you're always thinking about what's tomorrow? What am I doing next? How I've got this risk coming up. How can I mitigate against it? I've got this opportunity. And you never really give yourself a pat on the back, but also you never really look back and go, right, what's the next action from a risk perspective from the size we've got to? You're just constantly looking forward and going, what's next? And really, when you say things like that, somebody replays back to you, what does it feel like that you're now at startup phase? Well, we're going 10 years, 100 odd employees. I still feel like a startup because you don't really look back and reflect on it. You just think about what's tomorrow going to bring and how we're going to deal with it.
What advice would you have for a business that was in the process of looking for either funding or investment, you know, for whatever that might be, whether it's growth or, you know, it's their exit strategy, whatever it might be? What would you be looking for in that business?
I think the best advice for that is just making sure that you've got the right people on board and making sure that whoever's going to be investing into a business is going to make sure that the team and the leadership team are right for it. And that changes throughout the life cycle of the business. You've got key people in there that are absolutely instrumental to that business at different stages throughout, and just making sure that you've got the right team in place for us, one of the biggest differences that we've seen made is actually the introduction of an FD. We had an outsourced FD before, we had a few finance internally, and we always thought it's a very big expense. How could we possibly justify an FD? But really having somebody in that has that kind of knowledge, they become invaluable. And now you could never live without that. They're making tangible differences that you could never really appreciate. And for us, that really helps give a real structured plan of where you're going in growth. But if you'd been asking me a few years ago when we were a lot earlier as a business, I think that's really shifted of what's what to look for if they're going to invest into the business. When we first started, I mean, I was a bit of a one-man band in the first place, even though I had quite a big business. From a leadership perspective, I was so instrumental to that business that if we were seeking investment in it, had I not been there or not been able to work, the business would have crumbled. As we've grown as a business, that's shifted. I mean, I'm probably at the stage now where I'm a bit more replaceable than I was. And that has now shifted down to different key leaders within the business that would leave a big hole should they not be there. And that's whether they depart or if something happened to them, if they've, God forbid, but they got like really ill or passed away or anything like that. There's certain people in that business that would really affect us. I think I saw a recent stat is over half businesses would fail within a year or cease trading if they lost one of their key people. I think the big question for us would have been, who is the key people? Because that has changed consistently throughout the journey of the business. One of those now will be the FD, as I've spoken to about. It's just really for us understanding how have you got a leadership team in at different stages of your business. Anyone who's going to be looking to invest in you at the early stages, or if somebody exiting, or even refinancing debt, is going to making sure that they've got a safe pair of hands for it to go to. And what's the longevity of that business? Are the team bought in? And what would happen to them if one of those ceased to work there, or suddenly left, or suddenly unable to work for whatever reason that may be? What's the succession plan? Will the business still be able to trade, and will still be going?
And I think it's interesting because I think having that in place actually makes the business more investable. Not having single points of failure at a really high level, as you were for so many years, actually makes that business, I guess, more attractive to investors because there is a plan in place. There is that ability for people to pick up bits and pieces of stuff that you might have done historically or an FD would do when you bring them in. So, you know, I guess from your perspective, is that a sign of evolution or a sign of actually good leadership that you've created that security?
Yeah, you want to make yourself replaceable as a business owner, but then it becomes if you made yourself replaceable, which is great, and you don't necessarily need to be into work on the business as we talked about, have you then just shifted that to somebody else? Have you just moved that and somebody else has then that responsibility? I think any investor looking into a business for whatever reason that may be, is going to look at what their resilience is. What's their disaster recovery plan? They might have a disaster recovery plan for the business if it gets flooded or the phones, but have they got a disaster recovery plan for the people? Because ultimately it's the people that power the business. And you might have all the DR plans in the world, but if you haven't got a disaster recovery plan for the people that are in place, then there's a real single point of failure in there.
It's a really interesting lesson for a lot of business owners, that I'm sure, and something that, you know, you've clearly thought a lot about.
Yeah, well, we actually had a conversation about these ones before, because didn't you have a customer that was it Formula One that had an issue with that?
Yeah, so it stumped me a little bit, this one, to be honest. So I got approached years ago by a Formula One team. So my immediate reaction, like most, I think, would be that it would either be, they were looking into some key person insurance, and, you know, it's a Formula One team, it wasn't going to be a small amount of insurance they were looking for.
You just presume it's going to be the driver or the team principal.
That's exactly what I did. I went looking at the particular team, which I won't name, but I went looking at their who owned it and the drivers, because I thought, well, it's a car. It must be the person who's driving it around or the person who owns it. And anyway, the email came in with this name on of no one I'd ever heard of. Googled him, couldn't find it. There was no record of this person anywhere. But actually, the most important person they felt to the success of that business was the person that gave them the edge. And the person that gave them the edge was the panel beater, not the driver. So, you know, with things like key people, it's you've got to be able to understand the business properly to know where the real risks are, as opposed to just assuming that it's, the sales director or the managing director or whoever it might be, because every business is different.
And I suppose even using that analogy as well, that will have shifted over time. If you think back to when that team probably started out, it probably wasn't. It might have been someone else in that business. And as they've gone on, they've put the disaster recovery people in place for different areas, but still identified one single point of failure. And that's just one niche role.
Yeah. And apparently the real reason is that they're so difficult to find, because there's only a handful of them in the world that are that skilled that can make the difference to something as elite as a Formula One car.
I suppose for them, if you can't repair the car on time, it can't do the races, then the business has no business.
Absolutely. So as a founder who's been through growth stages, what advice would you give to owners of businesses that are either going through or looking to, grow and expand their business at the moment?
I think as your founder, as you go through that period and looking back on it, you've got two main criteria. You're looking into the future and going, right, what risks do I have and what opportunities do I have? So from a risks perspective, that's going to be, first of all, what financial risks do I have? And that's looking at the landscape, what's changing in terms of your product, your service. Are you still going to be able to sell it? Is it going to be old hat or out of date? Is there any changes coming on that front? Then looking at internally as well, what people you've got within the business, what risks could I have from that front? What risks might be coming to us across all different elements, and just trying to work out how do I mitigate against that. I was also simultaneously looking at what opportunities are coming. How can I grow the business? How can I scale? What's my growth and value creation plan? How am I going to grow? Whilst also making sure I've got the defensive play that if things aren't happening in the way that I want them to, what's our plan B? What's our plan C? How can we mitigate against that? And it's trying to get that balance between the offense and the defense and get those wrapped into one. And while you're looking ahead, it really helps then, as I mentioned before, is just having that team underneath you that can keep working on the business as is and on a day-to-day, whilst you can forward plan and really start thinking about what it is that's going to be changing in your industry and in the economy in general. What risks are there and what opportunities are going to present themselves?
Ollie, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. Great chat.
No problem. Thanks.